The courthouse on 5th Street wasn't much to look at. Paint peeling off the walls, fluorescent lights that flickered every few minutes, and that unmistakable smell of old coffee and stress that seemed to live in every government building. Room 304 was where Judge Harold Brennan held court, and if you asked anyone who'd been there, they'd tell you it wasn't a pleasant experience. 17-year-old Alex Carter sat in the back row of the courtroom gallery, a worn notebook open on his lap and a pen in his hand. He looked even younger than 17, with a baby face that made people guess he was maybe 14 or 15. Today he wore a plain hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. His backpack was tucked under the bench beside him, stuffed with law books and documents. This was Alex's 5th time coming to this particular courtroom in the past 3 weeks. He'd been watching, learning, taking notes on every case that came through. Most people probably thought he was a college student doing research, or maybe someone waiting for their own case to be called. Nobody paid much attention to the quiet kid in the back, but Alex was paying attention to everything. Judge Brennan was a large man in his late 50s, with gray hair and a permanent scowl that made him look like he'd just bitten into something sour. He'd been a judge for 25 years, and everyone in the courthouse knew his reputation. He ran his courtroom like a drill sergeant, had zero patience for mistakes, and wasn't shy about humiliating people he thought were wasting his time. "Next case," Brennan barked, not looking up from his papers. The bailiff called out, "Martinez versus Hoffman Properties, case number 248847. An elderly woman shuffled forward from the front row. She had to be at least 70, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and hands that trembled slightly as she clutched a worn folder to her chest. Her name was Rosa Martinez, and Alex had been waiting for her case to come up. Behind Mrs. Martinez walked a younger man, probably in his 40s, who looked tired and worried. That was her son, Luis. He put his hand on his mother's shoulder as they approached the defendant's table. On the other side of the courtroom, a man in an expensive suit stood up with the confidence of someone who did this every day. That was Vincent Keller, attorney for Hoffman Properties. His suit probably cost more than Mrs. Martinez paid in rent for 3 months. His briefcase was leather, his watch was gold, and his smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. "Your Honor," Keller began smoothly, "this is a straightforward eviction case. Mrs. Martinez violated the terms of her lease agreement by subletting her apartment without written permission from the landlord. We have documentation proving—" "Excuse me, Your Honor," Luis interrupted, his accent thick. "My mother, she doesn't understand. She needs someone to translate. She doesn't speak English so good." Judge Brennan looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "Is that right?" "Well, Mr. Martinez, this is an American courtroom. Your mother should have learned English after living here for—" He glanced at the papers. 20 years. Or she should have brought a lawyer who could speak for her. "We tried to get a lawyer, Your Honor, but we couldn't afford—" "Not my problem," Brennan cut him off. "The court provides translators for criminal cases, not civil matters. She had plenty of time to prepare for this hearing. If she chose not to get proper representation, that's on her." Mrs. Martinez was gripping her folder so tight her knuckles had turned white. She kept looking at her son, whispering questions in Spanish, clearly confused and scared. Luis tried to explain what was happening, speaking quickly in Spanish, but Keller objected immediately. "Your Honor, the son is not a certified translator. Any communication between him and the defendant should go through proper channels." "Sustained," Brennan said without hesitation. "Mr. Martinez, you can sit in the gallery, but you cannot translate for your mother during these proceedings." "But, Your Honor, she won't understand anything." "Then maybe she should have thought of that before she violated her lease." Brennan turned his attention to Mrs. Martinez, speaking slowly and loudly, like volume would somehow make up for the language barrier. "Mrs. Martinez, do you understand why you're here today?" She looked terrified, nodding her head even though Alex could tell she didn't understand a word. "Your landlord says you let someone else live in your apartment without permission. Is that true?" Mrs. Martinez looked at Luis desperately. He tried to answer for her, but the judge held up his hand. "I asked her, not you." Brennan sighed heavily. "Mr. Keller, present your evidence." Keller pulled out a folder and began listing the accusations. According to him, Mrs. Martinez had allowed her sister to move into the apartment 6 months ago, which violated the lease. The lease clearly stated no subletting without written permission. They had proof. A neighbor had reported seeing another person living there. Mail had been delivered to the apartment with a different name. and the building superintendent had confirmed seeing 2 women living in the unit. Your Honor, Hoffman Properties has been more than patient with Mrs. Martinez. We sent multiple notices asking her to remedy the situation. She ignored them all. We have no choice but to proceed with eviction. Brennan nodded, already looking convinced. Mrs. Martinez, do you have anything to say in your defense? Mrs. Martinez said something in Spanish, her voice shaking. Nobody in the courtroom understood her except Luis, who was practically bouncing in his seat wanting to translate. I didn't catch that, Brennan said sarcastically. Anyone speak Spanish? A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, but nobody volunteered. This was the pattern Alex had noticed over the past few weeks. Judge Brennan made it difficult for people who didn't speak perfect English, who didn't have lawyers, who didn't know how to navigate the system, and Hoffman Properties seemed to know exactly how to take advantage of that. Alex had done his research. Over the past 6 months, Hoffman Properties had filed eviction proceedings against 15 tenants in rent-controlled buildings. All elderly, all immigrants, all in apartments they'd lived in for decades. The pattern was obvious if you knew where to look. They were clearing out longtime tenants so they could renovate and triple the rent. Mrs. Martinez's violation was letting her recently widowed sister stay with her temporarily after she lost her home. It wasn't subletting. It was family helping family. But without a lawyer to explain that, without someone to translate, without anyone to fight for her, she was about to lose her home of 20 years. Judge Brennan picked up his gavel. Based on the evidence presented and the defendant's failure to provide an adequate defense, I'm prepared to rule, Your Honor. The voice came from the back of the courtroom. Alex stood up, his notebook closed, his expression serious. Everyone turned to look at him. A teenager in a hoodie, barely old enough to drive, standing in the back row like he had any business interrupting a court proceeding. Judge Brennan's face went from irritated to downright angry. Excuse me? Who are you? And what do you think you're doing interrupting my courtroom? Alex walked down the center aisle, past the rows of wooden benches, past the other people waiting for their cases, right up to the bar that separated the gallery from the lawyer's area. My name is Alex Carter. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to speak with Mrs. Martinez about representation. Brennan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Representation? Are you a social worker? A law student? Because if you're just some kid who thinks he knows how the system works, I'm an attorney, Your Honor. Alex reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. I passed the California bar exam 4 months ago. I'm licensed to practice law in this state, and I'd like to offer my services to Mrs. Martinez if she'll accept. The courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Keller, the landlord's attorney, actually laughed out loud. You've got to be kidding me. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. This kid, I'm 17, Alex said calmly, but my age doesn't invalidate my bar license. Judge Brennan stared at the card Alex had placed on the bench. He picked it up, examined it closely, turned it over like he was looking for proof it was fake. But it wasn't fake. The California State Bar seal was right there, official and legitimate. The judge's expression shifted from confusion to something uglier. His ego had just been challenged by someone young enough to be his grandson, and he didn't like it one bit. So you passed the bar exam, Brennan said slowly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Good for you. I'm sure your parents are very proud. But passing a test and practicing law are 2 very different things, son. This is a real courtroom with real consequences. Real people's lives are affected by what happens here. I understand that, Your Honor, which is exactly why Mrs. Martinez deserves proper representation. She had plenty of time to get a lawyer. Brennan handed the card back dismissively. The fact that she didn't isn't my problem or yours. With respect, Your Honor, I'm offering to represent her now. The case hasn't been decided yet. She has a right to counsel. Keller stood up, his smooth lawyer voice taking on an edge. Your Honor, I have to object to this circus. I have a full docket today. I can't sit here while some teenager plays lawyer. This is insulting to the profession and a waste of the court's time. Other people in the courtroom were whispering now, some looking amused, others looking concerned. Luis was staring at Alex with desperate hope in his eyes. Mrs. Martinez didn't understand what was happening, but she could sense the tension. Judge Brennan looked around his courtroom, aware that people were watching, waiting to see what he'd do. His face was red now, his jaw clenched tight. Let me make something very clear, Mr. Carter, he said, his voice low and threatening. I've been practicing law since before you were born. I've seen hundreds of attorneys come through this courtroom, and I can spot a competent lawyer in about 5 minutes. You're a child who memorized some answers on a test. That doesn't make you qualified to represent anyone. The California State Bar disagrees with you, Your Honor. The courtroom gasped. Nobody talked back to Judge Brennan like that, nobody. Brennan's face went from red to purple. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. Fine, you want to play lawyer? I'll allow it. But let me warn you right now. If you waste 1 minute of this court's time, if you show even a hint that you don't know what you're doing, I will hold you in contempt and have you removed from this courthouse. Do you understand me? I understand perfectly, Your Honor. And another thing, Brennan continued, clearly enjoying the chance to put this kid in his place. Don't think for a second that your little stunt impresses me. I've forgotten more about law than you'll ever know. So you better bring your A game, because I promise you, I will not go easy on you just because you're young. Alex met the judge's eyes steadily. I wouldn't want you to, Your Honor. Judge Brennan waved his hand dismissively. Fine. You've got 15 minutes to talk to your client. But we're not delaying this case any longer than that. This court has a schedule to keep. Alex nodded and walked over to where Mrs. Martinez stood looking confused and frightened. Luis jumped up from the gallery and rushed over to them. Thank you, Luis whispered urgently. Thank you so much. But who are you? How did you know about my mother's case? I've been watching this courtroom for weeks, Alex said quietly, pulling out his notebook. I knew your mother's case was coming up. Can you translate for me while I ask her some questions? For the next 15 minutes, Alex sat with Mrs. Martinez and Luis at the defendant's table, going through documents and asking questions. Mrs. Martinez pulled papers from her worn folder with shaking hands. Lease agreements, rent receipts going back 20 years, letters from the landlord, photos of her apartment. As Alex listened to her story through Luis's translation, his jaw tightened. Mrs. Martinez's sister hadn't been subletting at all. She'd lost her husband 6 months ago and had nowhere to go. Mrs. Martinez took her in temporarily while she got back on her feet. The lease specifically allowed for family guests. This wasn't a violation. This was a family taking care of each other, but Hoffman Properties didn't care about that. They wanted her out so they could renovate and charge 3 times the rent. Judge Brennan kept checking his watch loudly, making it clear he thought this was all a waste of time. Vincent Keller, the landlord's attorney, sat at his table looking bored and slightly amused, like he was watching a kid's school play. When the 15 minutes were up, Brennan banged his gavel. Time's up. Let's proceed. Mr. Carter, I assume you've had enough time to realize you're in over your head. Actually, Your Honor, I'm ready to proceed with Mrs. Martinez's defense. Of course you are. Brennan settled back in his chair with a smirk. This should be entertaining. Go ahead, counselor. Present your case. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly. A few people in the courtroom chuckled. Alex felt his face get hot, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd expected this. He'd prepared for this. Your Honor, before we continue with the eviction proceedings, I'd like to file 3 preliminary motions. Alex pulled papers from his backpack and approached the bench. Brennan looked annoyed. Motions? We don't need motions. This is a simple eviction case. With respect, Your Honor, these motions are necessary to ensure my client receives a fair hearing. Alex handed copies to both the judge and to Keller. First, I'm moving for a continuance to allow for proper translation services. Second, I'm challenging the validity of the eviction notice based on improper service. And third, I'm requesting that the court examine whether this eviction constitutes retaliatory action under California Civil Code Section 1942.5. Keller stood up, no longer looking amused. Your Honor, these motions are clearly a delay tactic. The defendant has had months to prepare a defense. My client didn't have legal representation until 10 minutes ago. Alex interrupted. She has a right to adequate time to prepare her case. She had adequate time, Brennan shot back. She chose not to use it. Motion denied. Your Honor, regarding the improper service, also denied. But Your Honor, the eviction notice was delivered to the wrong address. According to the proof of service, Mr. Carter, I said denied. Are you hard of hearing? Brennan's voice was getting louder. Or do you think you can argue with every ruling I make? Alex took a breath. Stay calm, he told himself. Don't let him rattle you. I'm simply trying to ensure my client's rights are protected, Your Honor. Her rights are fine. What's not fine is you wasting this court's time with frivolous motions. Now, are you going to present an actual defense, or are you going to keep filing paperwork, hoping something sticks? Several people in the courtroom laughed again. Alex felt like he was back in middle school being picked on by bullies, except this bully wore a robe and had the power to ruin people's lives. I'll present my defense, Your Honor. Finally. Please enlighten us with your legal wisdom. The sarcasm in Brennan's voice was thick enough to cut. Alex turned to face the courtroom, gathering his thoughts. He'd practiced this, gone over it 100 times in his head. He knew the law inside and out. But knowing the law and convincing a hostile judge were two different things. Your Honor, the landlord claims Mrs. Martinez violated her lease by subletting her apartment. But if you look at the lease agreement, Section 7, Paragraph 3, it clearly states that tenants may have family members stay as guests for up to 6 months without written permission. That's for visiting guests. Keller interjected smoothly. Not for someone taking up permanent residence. Mrs. Martinez's sister was a guest, not a permanent resident. She was there temporarily while recovering from the loss of her husband and securing her own housing. Alex pulled out a document. I have a lease agreement showing that Mrs. Martinez's sister, Carmen Rodriguez, signed a rental agreement for her own apartment starting next month. This proves the arrangement was always intended to be temporary. Keller looked surprised for a split second before recovering. That doesn't change the fact that 2 people were living in a unit designated for 1 tenant. The lease allows for guests. It doesn't specify that guests cannot be family members in need. Under California law, Judge Brennan held up his hand. Spare me the lecture on California law, Mr. Carter. I've been interpreting California law since before you learned to read. Then Your Honor understands that tenant protections in rent-controlled housing are particularly strong, and that landlords cannot evict tenants for having family guests. Don't tell me what I understand. Brennan leaned forward, his eyes cold. What I understand is that you're a 17-year-old kid who thinks passing a test makes him a lawyer. Real attorneys know when to pick their battles. They know when a case is lost. But you're too inexperienced to see that. With respect, Your Honor. Stop saying with respect when you clearly have none. You barge into my courtroom. You interrupt proceedings, you file frivolous motions, and now you're arguing with me about basic tenancy law. I've been more than patient with you, but my patience is running out. The courtroom had gone quiet. Everyone could feel the tension. Mrs. Martinez didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She looked at Alex with worried eyes, probably wondering if this young person trying to help her was just making things worse. Luis was gripping the railing of the gallery so tight his knuckles were white. Alex felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. He could back down, apologize, let Mrs. Martinez lose her home like all the others, or he could push forward even if it meant making the judge angrier. He thought about his mom, about the day they got evicted when he was 8 years old, about sleeping in their car, about moving from shelter to shelter, about the attorney who couldn't be bothered to fight for them because they couldn't pay enough. He'd promised himself back then that if he ever got the chance, he'd be different. He'd fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Your Honor, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but Mrs. Martinez has lived in that apartment for 20 years. She's paid her rent on time every single month. She's been a model tenant. And now she's facing eviction not because she did anything wrong, but because the landlord wants to make more money. That's completely untrue, Keller said, standing up. Your Honor, I object to these baseless accusations against my client. Sustained. Mr. Carter, stick to the facts of the case, not conspiracy theories. They're not conspiracy theories. Your Honor, they're patterns. Alex pulled out more papers from his backpack. In the past 6 months, Hoffman Properties has filed eviction proceedings against 12 tenants. All elderly. All in rent-controlled apartments. All long-time residents. That's not a coincidence. That's a strategy. Brennan's face was turning red again. You're out of line, Mr. Carter, way out of line. Am I? Because I have documentation right here. 12 cases, 4 of which went through this very courtroom. 12 elderly tenants, all evicted on questionable grounds. All replaced by new tenants paying triple the rent. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Several people in the gallery sat up straighter, paying attention now. This wasn't just about Mrs. Martinez anymore. Keller jumped up. Your Honor, this is outrageous. He's making inflammatory accusations without any evidence. I move to have him held in contempt. I have plenty of evidence, Alex said, holding up a folder. Court records, rental listings, testimony from former tenants. Would you like me to present it all right now? Judge Brennan slammed his gavel down hard. That's enough. Both of you! Mr. Carter, you're skating on very thin ice right now. One more outburst like that and you'll be spending the night in a jail cell for contempt of court. Your Honor, I'm simply trying to provide context for why this eviction is happening. The context is simple. Your client violated her lease and now she's facing the consequences. That's all this court needs to know. But she didn't violate her lease. Alex's voice rose despite himself. That's the whole point. The landlord is twisting the terms of the agreement to justify an eviction that wouldn't otherwise be legal. You're arguing in circles, son. And you're testing my patience. Maybe your patience needs to be tested. The words came out before Alex could stop them. The entire courtroom gasped. Even Keller looked shocked. Judge Brennan stood up slowly, his face now completely red, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. What did you just say to me? Alex knew he'd crossed a line. But he also knew that sometimes you had to cross lines to make things happen. Sometimes you had to risk everything to do what was right. I said maybe your patience needs to be tested, Your Honor. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've already made up your mind about this case. You decided Mrs. Martinez was guilty the moment you saw she didn't have a lawyer and didn't speak English. And that's not justice. That's prejudice. The courtroom exploded in noise. People were talking over each other. Some shocked, some approving. Luis looked terrified. Mrs. Martinez was crying. Judge Brennan pointed at Alex, his hand shaking with anger. You are in contempt of court. Bailiff, remove this child from my courtroom immediately. The bailiff, a large man who'd been standing quietly by the door, started walking toward Alex. But before he could reach him, a voice called out from the back of the courtroom. Your Honor, I'd like to request permission to address the court. Everyone turned. A woman in an expensive suit was standing up, someone Alex had noticed sitting in the back but hadn't paid attention to. She looked important, the kind of person who commanded attention just by standing up. And who are you? Brennan demanded. My name is Patricia Foster. I'm with the California State Bar Association's Ethics Committee, and I've been observing these proceedings with great interest. Judge Brennan froze, his hand still pointing at Alex. The color drained from his face as he processed what the woman had just said. State Bar Ethics Committee. Those 5 words changed everything. You're from the Ethics Committee? Brennan's voice had lost its aggressive edge. I wasn't informed that anyone from the Bar Association would be observing today. That's because ethics reviews are conducted without prior notice. Your Honor, it helps us see how courts actually operate rather than how they operate when they know they're being watched. Patricia Foster walked down the aisle with confidence, her heels clicking on the tile floor. And what I've witnessed this morning has been quite educational. The bailiff had stopped midway to Alex, unsure what to do now. The courtroom was dead silent except for Mrs. Martinez's quiet sniffling. Vincent Keller, the landlord's attorney, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. This was not how his simple eviction case was supposed to go. I'm simply maintaining order in my courtroom, Brennan said, but his voice had lost its certainty. This young man has been disruptive and disrespectful. This young man, Patricia interrupted gently, is a licensed attorney representing a client, and from what I've observed, he's been trying to do his job while facing considerable hostility from the bench. He accused me of being biased. Did he? Or did he point out legitimate concerns about how this case is being handled? Patricia pulled out a small notebook. In the last 30 minutes, I've watched you deny a request for translation services, refuse to grant reasonable continuance for newly acquired counsel, dismiss multiple motions without proper consideration, and mock this attorney repeatedly based on his age rather than his arguments. Brennan opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Patricia continued, I've also heard some very interesting information about patterns in eviction cases. 12 cases in 6 months, all involving elderly tenants in rent-controlled housing. That's the kind of pattern that raises red flags for the Ethics Committee, and possibly the district attorney's office. Keller stood up quickly. Your Honor, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Perhaps we could take a short recess to— Sit down, Mr. Keller. Patricia's voice was calm but firm. You'll have your turn to speak. Right now, I'd like to hear more about these eviction cases Mr. Carter mentioned. Alex, would you like to continue your presentation? Alex looked at the woman, then at Judge Brennan, then back at Patricia. His heart was still racing from the confrontation, but now he felt something else. Hope. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Judge Brennan sank back into his chair, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. Bailiff, you can return to your post. We'll continue with the hearing. Alex took a deep breath and gathered his papers. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Your Honor, as I was saying before, there's a clear pattern of Hoffman Properties targeting elderly tenants in rent-controlled apartments. I have documentation of 12 cases, and I'd like to present evidence showing how Mrs. Martinez's case fits that pattern. Proceed, Brennan said quietly. He wasn't making eye contact with anyone now. Alex laid out his evidence piece by piece. He had printouts of all 12 eviction cases filed by Hoffman Properties in the past 6 months. He'd highlighted the similarities. All elderly tenants, all in buildings over 20 years old, all in rent-controlled units, all evicted on minor technical violations. Then he showed what happened after each eviction. Every single apartment had been renovated and re-rented at prices 3 to 4 times higher than what the previous tenant had been paying. This isn't about lease violations, Alex said, his confidence growing as he presented his case. This is about profit. Hoffman Properties is systematically removing long-time tenants so they can renovate and charge market rates instead of controlled rates. Your Honor, I object to this entire line of argument, Keller said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. What other landlords choose to do with their properties after tenants leave is irrelevant to this case. Actually, it's very relevant, Alex countered, because it establishes motive and pattern. It shows that Hoffman Properties has a strategy of finding minor lease violations, or creating situations that can be interpreted as violations, then using those as grounds for eviction. Alex pulled out more documents. In Mrs. Martinez's case, her sister Carmen wasn't subletting. She was a guest, which is explicitly allowed under the lease. But Hoffman Properties is trying to redefine what constitutes a guest versus a subtenant. He held up the lease agreement, pointing to the relevant section. Section 7, paragraph 3 states that tenants may have family guests for up to 6 months. Carmen Rodriguez has been staying with her sister for 5 months. That's within the allowed time frame. Furthermore, she has her own lease starting next month for a different apartment, proving this was always temporary. But she received mail at the address, Keller argued weakly. She changed her address with the post office. Having mail forwarded to where you're temporarily staying doesn't make you a subtenant. It makes you someone who wants to receive their bills and important documents. My client broke no rules. Hoffman Properties is simply trying to manufacture a violation where none exists. Alex was on a roll now, and he could feel the momentum shifting. Even Judge Brennan was listening instead of interrupting. I'd also like to call attention to the timing of this eviction notice. It was filed exactly 1 week after Mrs. Martinez filed a maintenance request for a broken heater and water damage in her bathroom, requests that had been ignored for 3 months. He pulled out copies of the maintenance requests, all stamped with received dates. This is textbook retaliation. Under California Civil Code Section 1942.5, landlords cannot evict tenants in retaliation for requesting necessary repairs. Yet that's exactly what happened here. Keller was flipping through his own papers now, looking for something to counter with. But Alex had done his homework thoroughly. Your Honor, Alex continued, I move that this eviction be dismissed with prejudice, and I request that the court forward this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of possible housing discrimination and tenant harassment. The courtroom was buzzing now. People were whispering to each other, and several folks had pulled out their phones to take notes or record what was happening. Patricia Foster was writing in her notebook, a small smile on her face. Judge Brennan cleared his throat. Mr. Keller, would you like to respond to these allegations? Keller stood up, straightening his expensive tie. Your Honor, my client operates a legitimate property management business. Any suggestion of systematic discrimination is pure speculation. As for Mrs. Martinez specifically, the evidence clearly shows. The evidence shows that your client has a pattern of targeting vulnerable tenants, Alex interrupted. And I can prove it. You haven't proven anything except that you know how to make charts and draw connections where none exist. Keller shot back, some of his confidence returning. Young man, pattern recognition doesn't equal causation. Hoffman Properties has every right to enforce their lease agreements. They have a right to enforce legitimate violations. They don't have a right to fabricate violations or retaliate against tenants for requesting repairs. We didn't fabricate anything. There was another person living in that apartment. A family guest, which is allowed. Gentlemen. Judge Brennan's voice cut through their argument. That's enough. We're not going to solve this by yelling at each other. He looked at Alex for a long moment, and something in his expression had changed. The mockery was gone. The condescension was gone. Instead, there was something that looked almost like respect. Mr. Carter, you've presented compelling evidence, more compelling than I initially gave you credit for. Brennan glanced at Patricia Foster, who was still watching carefully. However, I need time to review all of this documentation properly. We're going to take a 1-hour recess. When we return, I'll hear closing arguments from both sides, and then I'll make my ruling. Your Honor, I have other cases scheduled, Keller began. Then you'll have to reschedule them. This case deserves proper consideration. Brennan looked at Alex. Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology. I judged you based on your age rather than your abilities, and that was wrong. You've proven yourself to be a competent attorney, and I should have recognized that from the start. Alex blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected an apology. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet. I still have to review the evidence and make a ruling, but I want you to know that your arguments have been heard and they'll be given serious consideration. Brennan banged his gavel. Court is in recess for 1 hour. As people started filing out of the courtroom, Luis rushed up to Alex, tears streaming down his face. Thank you so much. Nobody's ever fought for my mother like this. Mrs. Martinez grabbed Alex's hand and squeezed it, saying something in Spanish that Luis translated. She says you're like an angel God sent to help us. Alex felt his own eyes getting wet. I just did what any lawyer should do. I fought for someone who couldn't fight for themselves. Patricia Foster approached them, extending her hand to Alex. That was impressive work, young man. I've been practicing law for 23 years, and I've seen attorneys with decades of experience who couldn't have presented a case that well. You were really observing for the ethics committee? Alex asked. I really was. We've had some complaints about this courtroom, about how certain cases are being handled. Your timing was perfect. She handed him her business card. When this is over, I'd like to talk to you about some opportunities. We need more attorneys like you. During the recess, Alex sat on a bench outside the courtroom going over his notes one more time. He wanted to make sure his closing argument was perfect. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. This was about exposing a system that was failing people like Mrs. Martinez. Keller approached him and Alex tensed, expecting more confrontation. But the older attorney's expression was complicated. Look, kid, Alex, what you did in there was either really brave or really stupid. I haven't decided which yet. Does it matter? Alex asked. Maybe not. Keller glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Between you and me, I've been telling Hoffman Properties they need to change their approach. But they pay well and I've got bills to pay. That's how it works in the real world. Then maybe the real world needs to change. Keller laughed without humor. You really are young, aren't you? Good luck in there. Something tells me you won't need it, though. When court reconvened an hour later, the gallery was more packed than before. Word had spread through the courthouse about the teenage attorney standing up to Judge Brennan, and people had come to watch how it ended. Alex took his place at the defendant's table, Mrs. Martinez beside him looking hopeful for the first time all day. Judge Brennan entered and took his seat, and Alex noticed he looked different somehow. Less arrogant, more thoughtful. We're back on the record in Martinez versus Hoffman Properties, Brennan announced. Mr. Carter, your closing argument. Alex stood up and every eye in the courtroom was on him. This was it. Everything came down to the next few minutes. He thought about his mom, about all the nights they'd spent in that car, about the promise he'd made to himself. And then he began to speak. Alex took a deep breath and looked around the courtroom. All these people watching him, waiting to see if the kid could actually pull this off. He felt the weight of the moment, but he also felt something else. Purpose. Your Honor, members of the court, when I walked into this courtroom today, I knew exactly what I was going to see. I'd seen it 4 times before in the past 3 weeks. An elderly tenant standing alone, confused, unable to defend themselves properly. A landlord's attorney with expensive suits and smooth words, and a system that seemed designed to move people through as quickly as possible, rather than actually deliver justice. He paused, making eye contact with Judge Brennan, who was listening carefully now. Mrs. Martinez has lived in her apartment for 20 years. 20 years of paying rent on time every single month. 20 years of being a good neighbor, maintaining her home, following the rules. She raised her children there. She built her life there. That apartment isn't just a unit number to her. It's her home. Alex picked up the lease agreement. The landlord claims she violated her lease by having her sister stay with her. But the lease explicitly allows family guests for up to 6 months. Her sister has been there for 5 months, and she already has her own apartment lined up for next month. This was always temporary. A widowed woman needed help, and her sister provided it. That's not a violation. That's family taking care of each other. Several people in the gallery nodded. Alex could feel the room connecting with his words. But this isn't really about a lease violation, is it? It's about money. Hoffman Properties isn't trying to enforce rules. They're trying to clear out longtime tenants so they can renovate and triple the rent. And they're not just doing it to Mrs. Martinez. They're doing it to elderly tenants all over the city. He held up the folder of documentation. 12 evictions in 6 months. All elderly tenants. All in rent-controlled units. All replaced by new tenants paying 3 to 4 times more rent. That's not a coincidence. That's a business strategy, and it's wrong. Vincent Keller shifted uncomfortably in his seat but didn't object. Even he could feel how the room had turned. There's something else I want to address, Alex continued, his voice getting stronger. This morning when I stood up to represent Mrs. Martinez, I was mocked. I was called a child. I was told I was playing dress-up and wasting the court's time. And I understand why. I'm 17. I look young. I don't have decades of experience. He looked directly at Judge Brennan again. But the law doesn't care how old I am. The California State Bar certified me to practice law in this state because I proved I understand the law and can apply it competently. My age doesn't make Mrs. Martinez's case any less valid. It doesn't make her rights any less important. And it shouldn't make this court take her situation any less seriously. Alex could see some people in the gallery wiping their eyes. Mrs. Martinez was gripping Luis's hand tightly, even though she couldn't understand most of what was being said. When I was 8 years old, my mother and I were evicted from our apartment. The landlord claimed we'd violated the lease, but really, my mom had complained about black mold making me sick. She'd filed complaints with the city, and suddenly we were out on the street. His voice cracked slightly, and he took a moment to compose himself. We lived in our car for 2 weeks, then in shelters for 4 months. I watched my mom cry herself to sleep, watched her work 3 jobs trying to save enough for a new place, watched her lose her dignity piece by piece because the system failed us. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even Keller wasn't looking at his papers anymore. My mom had an attorney for that eviction hearing, but he was overworked, underpaid, and dealing with 50 other cases. He spent maybe 10 minutes preparing. He told my mom she should just accept the eviction and move on. Find a new place, start over. Like it was that simple. Like we weren't about to become homeless. Alex's hands were shaking, but he kept going. That experience is why I studied law. Why I spent every free moment in the library reading legal books. Why I graduated high school at 15 and took the bar exam at 16. Because I never wanted to see another family go through what we went through. I never wanted to see another elderly person standing in court alone, terrified, facing the loss of their home because the system didn't protect them. He turned to look at Mrs. Martinez, who was crying now even though she didn't understand his words. She understood his emotion, though. That was universal. Mrs. Martinez deserves better than this. She deserves a system that protects longtime residents. She deserves a court that listens to her side of the story. She deserves justice, not just processing. And she deserves to stay in the home she's built over the past 20 years. Alex looked back at Judge Brennan. Your Honor, I'm asking you to dismiss this eviction. Not because I'm a good speaker, or because I've pulled on heartstrings, but because the law is on Mrs. Martinez's side. She didn't violate her lease. She's being targeted as part of a systematic effort to displace vulnerable tenants, and this court has the power to stop it. He gathered his papers and prepared to sit down, but then added one more thing. Earlier today, you said you've been a judge for 25 years, that you've seen hundreds of attorneys, that you could tell who was competent in 5 minutes. Alex's voice was quiet but clear. "I hope that after today you'll judge attorneys by their arguments and their preparation, not by their age or appearance. Because justice shouldn't depend on whether someone looks like your idea of what a lawyer should look like. It should depend on whether they're fighting for what's right." He sat down. The courtroom erupted in applause before Judge Brennan could even reach for his gavel. People were standing, clapping, some openly crying. Luis was hugging his mother. Patricia Foster was nodding approvingly. Brennan let the applause continue for a moment before banging his gavel. "Order. Order in the court." But he didn't sound angry. He sounded moved. "Mr. Keller, your closing argument." Vincent Keller stood slowly. He looked at his notes, then at the courtroom, then at Judge Brennan. For a long moment he just stood there. "Your Honor," he finally said, "I've been practicing law for 18 years. I've won a lot of cases. I've made a lot of money for my clients. But standing here right now, listening to that closing argument, I realize something." He paused, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. "I realize that I've been on the wrong side of too many cases like this one. I've told myself it's just business, that I'm just doing my job, that these tenants would lose anyway, so it doesn't matter if I'm the one representing the landlord." Keller looked at Alex, and there was something almost like respect in his eyes. "But it does matter. Because every time I take a case like this, I'm helping to displace someone from their home. I'm helping to destroy communities. I'm choosing my paycheck over someone else's life." Judge Brennan leaned forward, looking surprised. "Mr. Keller, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "Your Honor, I'm withdrawing as counsel for Hoffman Properties in this case. Furthermore, I'm recommending that my firm drop Hoffman Properties as a client entirely until they change their business practices." He started gathering his papers. "And I'm going to suggest to Mrs. Martinez's family that they consider filing a countersuit for harassment and wrongful eviction attempt." The courtroom exploded again. People were talking over each other. Reporters were furiously taking notes, and Luis looked like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Brennan banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order, I need order." When the room finally quieted down, Brennan looked at Keller. "Mr. Keller, you understand the implications of what you're doing?" "I do, Your Honor. And I should have done it a long time ago." Keller nodded to Alex. "This kid just taught me more about being a lawyer than I've learned in the past decade. Sometimes it takes fresh eyes to see what's right in front of you." He packed up his briefcase and walked out of the courtroom. Just like that. Judge Brennan sat back in his chair, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. "Well, this is unprecedented. I suppose that means there's no longer anyone opposing the dismissal of this eviction." "Your Honor," Patricia Foster stood up from the gallery, "if I may address the court." "Ms. Foster, you've already had quite an impact on today's proceedings. What else would you like to add?" "I'd like to formally request that the Bar Association's Ethics Committee open an investigation into Hoffman Properties' eviction practices. Based on what I've heard today, there are serious questions about whether they've been engaging in systematic housing discrimination and elder abuse." "I'll forward the case files to your office," Brennan said. "Anything else?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'd also like to commend you for how you've handled the second half of these proceedings. It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes, especially from the bench. I think what we've all witnessed today is how the legal system is supposed to work, when everyone involved is willing to listen and learn." Brennan nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Foster." He looked at Alex and Mrs. Martinez. "Mrs. Martinez, through your attorney, I want you to know that this eviction is dismissed with prejudice. That means Hoffman Properties cannot bring these same charges against you again. You're free to remain in your home." Luis translated rapidly for his mother, who let out a cry of joy and relief. She was sobbing and laughing at the same time, clutching her son's hand. "Furthermore," Brennan continued, "I'm issuing a formal warning to Hoffman Properties. Their business practices will be under scrutiny from this point forward. And I'll be reviewing all of their previous eviction cases that came through my courtroom to determine if any others warrant reconsideration." He looked at Alex for a long moment. "Mr. Carter, I made a mistake today. Several mistakes, actually. I judged you unfairly, I treated you dismissively, and I nearly let my ego prevent a miscarriage of justice. You've taught me a valuable lesson about keeping an open mind and remembering why we're all here in the first place." Alex felt tears building in his eyes but fought them back. "Thank you, Your Honor. No, thank you. And I mean that sincerely." Brennan picked up his gavel. "This court is adjourned." As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted one final time. People rushed forward to congratulate Alex. Mrs. Martinez was hugging him and crying. Luis was shaking his hand so hard Alex thought his arm might fall off. Reporters were shouting questions. "Alex, how does it feel to win your first case? Did you know someone from the ethics committee was watching? What made you decide to become a lawyer so young?" Through the chaos, Alex caught Patricia Foster's eye. She smiled and gave him a thumbs up, and in that moment, Alex knew that everything he'd been through, the homelessness, the struggles, the endless studying, the doubt, had all been worth it. He'd made a difference. He'd saved someone's home. He'd reminded a judge about justice, and he was just getting started. 3 months had passed since that day in court, and Alex's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The local news had run the story for a week straight. Teen attorney defeats judge's bias, saves elderly woman's home. His phone had been ringing nonstop with interview requests, case inquiries, and even a few job offers. But the biggest change came from Patricia Foster and the Bar Association. They'd offered him a position with their new Tenant Rights Initiative, a program specifically designed to help vulnerable people facing wrongful evictions. It was part-time so he could finish his education. But it came with an office, resources, and most importantly, the backing of the entire legal community. Alex was sitting in his small office, reviewing case files when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Luis. "My mom wants to cook you dinner tonight. She won't take no for an answer." Alex smiled. Mrs. Martinez had been cooking him dinner at least once a week since the trial. She'd practically adopted him, calling him mijo and making sure he was eating enough. It was the closest thing to family he'd had since his own mom passed away 2 years ago. "Tell her I'll be there at 6, he texted back. There was a knock on his office door. "Come in," Alex called out. Judge Harold Brennan walked in, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes instead of his usual robe. Alex stood up quickly, surprised. "Your Honor, I wasn't expecting. Please call me Harold when we're not in court." Brennan closed the door behind him. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just reviewing some cases. Have a seat." Alex gestured to the chair across from his desk. It felt strange having a judge sitting in his office like a regular person. Brennan sat down heavily, looking around at the small space. "So this is where you work now. It's good. Modest, but good." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I wanted to update you on something. The Ethics Committee finished their investigation into Hoffman Properties." Alex leaned forward. "And? They found evidence of systematic discrimination and harassment targeting elderly tenants across 12 properties. The district attorney's office is filing criminal charges. Hoffman himself is facing fines and possibly jail time." Brennan paused. "They also reviewed my courtroom records from the past 2 years." Alex's stomach tightened. "What did they find?" "That I'd been too quick to rule in favor of landlords in housing cases. That I hadn't been providing adequate TI. Me for unrepresented defendants. That my courtroom had developed a reputation for being hostile to certain groups of people." Brennan looked directly at Alex. "I've been formally reprimanded and ordered to complete bias training. It'll be on my record." "I'm sorry," Alex said, and he meant it. He hadn't wanted to destroy the judge's career. "Don't be sorry. I deserved it. Maybe worse." Brennan rubbed his face tiredly. "You know what the hardest part is? Looking back at all those cases and wondering how many people I failed. How many families lost their homes because I was too impatient or too arrogant to give them a fair hearing. You can't change the past," Alex said quietly, "but you can do better going forward. That's what I'm trying to do. I've started reaching out to some of the tenants from those previous cases, helping them understand they might have grounds for appeal. It's not much, but it's something." Brennan managed a small smile. "One of them is filing an appeal next month, actually. And she asked if you'd represent her." Alex felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I'd be honored." They talked for another half hour about the changes Brennan was implementing in his courtroom, about the cases Alex was taking on, about the state of tenant rights in the city. When Brennan finally stood to leave, he shook Alex's hand firmly. "You know, that day in court you said something that stuck with me. You said the law should be a shield for people who need protection, not a sword for the powerful to wield against the vulnerable. I'd forgotten that somewhere along the way. Thank you for reminding me." After Brennan left, Alex sat alone in his office for a while, thinking about how strange life was. 3 months ago, he'd been a kid nobody took seriously. Now he was making a real difference in people's lives. That evening, Alex showed up at Mrs. Martinez's apartment with flowers and a box of pastries. The moment she opened the door, she pulled him into a tight hug, speaking rapid Spanish that he was slowly starting to understand. She says, "You're too skinny, and she's going to fix that," Luis translated with a grin. The apartment was small but immaculate, filled with photos of family and the smell of home cooking. Mrs. Martinez's sister Carmen was there too, along with several of their kids and grandkids. They'd turned dinner into a celebration. During the meal, Luis pulled out his phone and showed Alex something. "You've seen this, right? It was a news article. Hoffman Properties files for bankruptcy following criminal charges. The company had collapsed under the weight of investigations, lawsuits, and the public backlash. Dozens of tenants they'd wrongfully evicted were getting their homes back or receiving settlements. It's over," Luis said. "You did it. You didn't just save my mom. You stopped them from doing this to anyone else." Alex didn't know what to say. He'd just been trying to help one person. He hadn't expected to bring down an entire company. Mrs. Martinez said something in Spanish, and Carmen translated this time. She says, "You're proof that God sends angels in unexpected forms, that young people will save the world because they haven't learned to be cynical yet." After dinner, Alex walked outside to get some air. The apartment building was in a quiet neighborhood, and he could see stars despite the city lights. He thought about his mom, about how proud she'd be, about how all those nights sleeping in their car, all those days wondering if things would ever get better, had somehow led him to this moment. His phone rang. It was Patricia Foster. "Alex, sorry to bother you in the evening, but something came up. Remember that case we discussed last week? The family with 3 kids facing eviction? The one where the landlord is claiming they have too many people in a 2-bedroom? That's the one. They just called. The landlord's attorney showed up at their apartment tonight with eviction papers. They're terrified. Can you help them?" Alex didn't even hesitate. "Text me the address. I'll head over there right now. You're not even surprised anymore when I call with emergencies, are you?" "It's what we do," Alex said simply. "We show up for people when they need us most." 20 minutes later, Alex was sitting at a kitchen table in a cramped apartment with a family of 5. The parents were in their 30s, barely speaking English. Trying to explain their situation while 3 young kids played in the corner, Alex listened carefully, took notes, looked over their lease and the eviction notice. The more he reviewed, the angrier he got. This was another case of a landlord trying to force out a family to renovate and raise rent. Another case of vulnerable people being targeted because they didn't know their rights. "This eviction notice isn't valid," Alex explained, using simple words and hand gestures to help them understand. They didn't follow proper procedure, and the California Health and Safety Code actually requires landlords to provide a minimum number of bedrooms based on occupancy. "You're within the legal limits." The mother started crying with relief. The father kept saying thank you over and over, even though Alex hadn't done anything yet except read some papers. "I'm going to fight this," Alex told them. "And we're going to win. But I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. Can you do that?" They both nodded eagerly. As Alex left their apartment that night, his phone buzzed with another text. Then another. More cases coming in. More people who needed help. More families facing the loss of their homes. A year ago, Alex would have felt overwhelmed, but now he felt something different. He felt ready. 6 months later, Alex found himself back in Judge Brennan's courtroom. But this time things were different. The courtroom had a new sign posted by the door. Translation services available in 12 languages. The waiting area had information pamphlets about tenant rights in multiple languages. And Judge Brennan himself seemed like a different person, patient, thoughtful, willing to listen. Alex had just finished presenting another housing case. Another elderly tenant, another questionable eviction, another victory for the people who needed protection. As court adjourned, several people approached Alex with questions about their own cases. He handed out business cards, took down information, promised to review their situations. This had become his routine. A young law student approached him nervously. "Mr. Carter? I'm studying at the university. I saw the news stories about you last year. You're kind of famous in the legal community now." Alex laughed. "I don't know about famous. I'm just trying to help people. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I'm thinking about specializing in tenant rights law, but everyone tells me it doesn't pay well, that I should go into corporate law or criminal defense if I want to make real money." The student hesitated. "But watching what you do, seeing the difference you make, I think this is what I want to do. Even if I don't get rich doing it." Alex put his hand on the student's shoulder. "Money isn't everything. Making a difference in someone's life? That's worth more than any paycheck. Trust me." That evening, Alex met up with Patricia Foster for coffee. She had news. The Bar Association wants to expand the Tenant Rights Initiative statewide. They're offering you a full-time position as the program director once you turn 18 next month. You'd be training other attorneys, developing resources, setting policy. She smiled. You'd be one of the youngest program directors in the state's history. "What about finishing high school?" Alex asked. "You already completed all your requirements through independent study. You're basically done. This would be your career, Alex. Your chance to create real systemic change instead of just fighting one case at a time." Alex thought about it for a moment. A year ago, he'd been a nobody trying to prove himself in Judge Brennan's courtroom. Now he was being offered a chance to change the system itself. "I'll do it," he said, "but on one condition. I still want to take individual cases sometimes. I don't want to become so focused on policy that I forget about the actual people we're trying to help." "Deal," Patricia said, extending her hand. On his 18th birthday, Alex stood in front of a room full of attorneys, judges, and legal advocates. He was being honored by the Bar Association for his work in tenant rights advocacy. Judge Brennan was there, sitting in the front row, applauding along with everyone else. When it was Alex's turn to speak, he looked out at all those faces, people who'd doubted him, people who'd supported him, people who'd learned from him. "A year ago, I walked into a courtroom as a 17-year-old nobody thought belonged there. I was mocked, dismissed, and told I was too young to understand how the real world works." He paused, meeting Judge Brennan's eyes. "But I learned something important that day. Age doesn't determine your ability to make a difference. Passion does. Courage does. Refusing to accept injustice does." He held up his bar card, the same one that had started everything. "This card doesn't make me special. What makes me special, what makes any of us special, is what we choose to do with the opportunities we're given. We can use our knowledge to get rich, or we can use it to serve people who need us. We can play it safe, or we can stand up and fight for what's right even when it's hard." Alex looked around the room. "Every single one of you has the power to change someone's life, to save a family's home, to stand between vulnerable people and those who would take advantage of them. That's what being a lawyer should mean, not winning arguments or making money, but protecting people who can't protect themselves." As he finished his speech and people stood to applaud, Alex felt his mom's presence somehow, like she was there with him, proud of the person he'd become. The kid who used to sleep in a car was now changing the system that had failed his family. The teenager who'd been mocked in court was now training other attorneys to fight for justice. And somewhere in the city, families were sleeping safely in their homes tonight because someone had finally stood up for them. That was what mattered. That was everything.